C'est avec un grand plaisir que je vous présente Marcus J. Ranum, qui va nous faire un discours.
One of the difficult things about being a dinner speaker is talking about information security. Because it's a pretty boring topic, and if I really tell people what I think about some of the things that are happening in information security, it would probably put you off of your dinner entirely, or get you depressed. I've had people ask me, what do you think about cloud computing? And then, about 10 minutes later, they've got tears pouring down their faces as they admit that they just invested $1 million in the cloud deployment. It's going to be a disaster, and I just explained why. When Eric asked me to speak tonight, I tried to think of something that might be useful, interesting, non-offensive, educational, and maybe a little thought-provoking. You can't really do all of that. So what I thought I would try to do is just give you some ideas that could be handy for you going forward. Talk a little bit about kind of where the threat landscape of the future is going to go. I did a bunch of stuff. I wrote, this is just me, obviously introduced me better than I can. I wrote some books that nobody read. I wrote some software that nobody runs anymore, and I've done a bunch of stuff. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the problem of cyber war. Cyber war is something I've been very interested in for the last decade because I'm an amateur military historian. I come from a family of historians. I've studied a great deal about the art of war and warfare and politics by other means, as von Clausewitz would say. And when people start talking about cyber war, I don't see anything in cyber war that bears anything other than the most superficial resemblance to actual warfare, which makes me ask some questions, like why are people talking about cyber war as if it should be something that's really scary? Can I see a show of hands of how many of you would rather have your city bombed than your routers crashed? Right? So I think I've made my point, right? And so there's some very odd things that are happening when people start talking about this new landscape of battle that we should be extremely afraid of. And I'm kind of going, well, that doesn't really scare me a whole lot, right? What are we really talking about? So I thought I would kind of parse apart the problem. There's a thing that happens when people who are planning on making a great deal of money about cyber war start talking about cyber war. I call it the cyber war gallop. It's named after a technique called the Gish gallop, which is used by a particular creationist in the US that I will talk about. But the idea of the Gish gallop or the cyber war gallop is you throw a whole bunch of extraneous information at your target, and then you say, and cyber war could be possible. So what you do is you hide a bunch of lies, and then you end with one thing that's true. And if you do this fast enough, people remember the one thing that's true, and the string of lies is a blur, and you kind of go, well, yeah, I guess that could happen. So the way this plays itself out in cyber war is be afraid, you're all going to die, the Chinese are going to take over your networks, the sewage is going to run backwards, the satellites are going to fall from the sky, airplanes are going to crash, and you all know all that malware that you keep getting on your machines? That's proof that operating systems are insecure, so this could all happen. Right? That's how it's played. And I heard a few laughs in the room because I played it for funny, but that's basically what we're hearing a great deal of the time. We're hearing cyber criminals are extremely successful, therefore your systems are not secure enough. Okay, that sort of stands to reason. Therefore, the Chinese are going to blow you up. Now, there's a very important point that I galloped by in that rather facetious example, and that's that nobody asks what geopolitical motive would cause the Chinese to do that in the first place, right? And I love this when I'm talking to members of the American cybersecurity and military-industrial complex, and I say, are you saying the Chinese are planning to attack us? No, the Chinese are just stealing our stuff. Oh, okay, everyone steals our stuff. Why does that bother you? We steal their stuff, they steal our stuff. It's called business. It's what capitalists do. And then they kind of go, yeah, but they're stealing our intellectual property. And I say, well, but I come from the United States of America. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I come from a country whose industrial revolution was entirely built on stolen Scottish, French, and English ideas, right? We used our cotton mills were all stolen from Monsieur Jacquard. Our steam engines were all Scottish, made by, I forget the guy's his name, who did the basic design, Mr. Watt, who did the basic design of the steam-powered steam engine. Railroads were all invented by the Indians. We actually, we invented some stuff, but there really wasn't a significant U.S. invention until Eli Whitney built the cotton gin, right? Which triggered our own bloody Civil War, but that's another whole story. So when people talk about stealing intellectual property, I kind of go, what's your beef, right? This is how business is done. Put differently, people in the United States Department of Defense military-industrial complex are talking a great deal about the Chinese allegedly stealing the plans for the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter plans, which leaked out around 2001, 2002. If you hear somebody talking about 10 terabytes worth of data being stolen, very important 10 terabytes worth of data stolen. If you hear people talking about that, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about 10 terabytes worth of CAD diagrams related to the Joint Strike Fighter, which of course leaked out from a U.S. partner, because the actual Joint Strike Fighter program is 16 countries that are all sort of working together to build this airplane by committee, so you know how well it works. So they're building this committee-built aircraft, and everybody's got access to the plans for it. So there's about probably 100,000 people in the world that have access to the Joint Strike Fighter CAD diagrams, and one of those guys was misbehaved a little bit with it. What a shock! What a surprise, right? And more to the point, what do the Chinese or whoever's got it going to do anyway? Build $200 airplanes that don't fly well. There's no value to doing this. There's no value to stealing it. Anyway, so what I thought I would do for the rest of the day, other than just make fun of some bad ideas, is kind of parse apart the different aspects of the cybersecurity landscape. And I have a whole bunch of slides, and I'm probably not going to go through all of them, so don't be afraid. I'm not going to keep you here all night. But this is slide number 4 of 270. So, just kidding. So what I wanted to do is parse apart the different focused problems that actually comprise the cybersecurity problem. And I'm guessing that by the time I'm done the next 4 slides or so, you're going to understand why a great deal of what you're being told about cyber war is largely nonsense, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the properties of attack and defense in those different areas to sort of try to undo this Gallup process that's been happening, okay? So the first of our players in the cyber war arena is the cyber criminal. And first off, they exist. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. There are people who are stealing your information and they're selling it. Now what they're doing is they're stealing very, very large amounts of very slightly valuable information. If you think about this, this is exactly the opposite from the Joint Strike Fighter thing, in which people are stealing essentially small amounts of nominally extremely valuable information. In fact, it's information that's so valuable that they probably can't use it, right? Again, what would be the value of having the CAD diagrams for a Joint Strike Fighter? Unless you have Boeing or Airbus, unless you have a massive heavy industry behind you and you need to carry out air dominance attacks, you don't have any use for a Joint Strike Fighter at all. It has no use for civilian aviation. It has no use for, what are you going to do, make a radio-controlled model car out of it? There's nothing useful you can do with this stuff. The cyber criminals just want your credit card data, and that's useful. They want your PayPal account. They want your World of Warcraft account. Now, nominally, these are not high-value items. They're fairly easy to get because we don't protect them very well, right? So when people tell you you should be afraid about cyber spies, they're trying to scare you with these cyber criminals who can get your World of Warcraft account. And the reason that they can get your World of Warcraft account is probably if I ask nicely, you'll give it to me. Whereas if I call up and ask for, plans for a Mark 82 hydrogen bomb, I have to ask very nicely and fairly persistently, and I'm probably still not going to get them, although I do have them on my laptop. I carry them around because I travel around the world a great deal, and at some border crossings they check for pornography, and I just think it's funny to carry hydrogen bomb plans on my laptop because nobody's ever asked me for those. They all go, "Do you have any pornography?" "Oh no, I don't care about that stuff." It's not very interesting. But so the cyber criminal's agenda is purely tactical. It's totally short-term. Whereas someone who's stealing military secrets, by definition, is doing that in a strategic context. Because if I steal the plans for a Joint Strike Fighter or a nuclear weapon, I can't just go to www.buildmeanuclearweapon.com, upload the plans, and have a nuclear weapon in 24 hours. I have to engage in a multi-decade-long, very complex engineering process that leaves fingerprints all over the world and costs billions of dollars. So even if we were to give somebody plans for an H-bomb, if you want them, by the way, I can give it to you. If we were to give those to somebody, so what? Right? You still need this massive industrial complex behind it. Now, the cyber criminals are tactical. They don't care. All they want to do is get your money, and they don't care if it's a large amount or it's a small amount. Because there's two ways you can steal $1 million. One way is to find one person and steal $1 million from them, and the other is to steal a dollar from 1 million people. Which one do you think is easier? Right? And the cyber criminals have figured that out. If you steal a dollar from 1 million people, first off, most people won't even notice. They probably won't care. It's below the level of what they spend at Starbucks every morning drinking terrible coffee. And so, obviously, they don't care about a dollar, right? Anybody who pay a dollar for a cup of coffee obviously doesn't care or understand the value of a dollar. So there's nothing we can do about these guys. And they are going to be a persistent presence because they can just go where the profit is. They can hit and run. And there's always going to be more taking their place. More to the point, they are able to, the last 2 points here, is that they're able to shift extremely quickly to where the money is, and they do it in parallel. So for any given possible area in which there could be a scam, there's probably 3 scammers thinking about how to go after it right now, right? There's probably some kid in Romania right now who's sparing a thought and going, I wonder how I could make money off of Twitter other than being Twitter. I wonder how I could make money off of Twitter, right? And if he figures that out, he'll make a lot of money, and then there'll be a lot of copycats, and then after the next 6 months, when we all figure out what the thing is, that will be valueless, and he's going to be going on to something else, right? So it's very shifting, it's very mercurial, and it's really impossible for us to eradicate these guys. This is bad news. We're never going to eradicate these guys, because it's always easier, unfortunately, it seems, to steal a dollar than it is to make one honestly. Just seems that way. And so there's always going to be people who would rather sleep in until noon, not have a boss, wake up and work for a couple hours, and then go hit the bar. And there's people who are going to be willing to live that lifestyle. In fact, come to think of it, maybe I should switch sides because it sounds pretty good. If you're willing to have people living that lifestyle, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop them. Now, let's talk about spies. The problem with espionage is it is not a tactical activity. It is a strategic activity. Espionage is also extremely expensive. Right? Now, when you hear people in the US talking about the Chinese cyber spies, right, the premise appears to be that the Chinese government is mounting these massive fishing expeditions against the entire world in which they're trying to collect Joint Strike Fighter plans, apparently, instead of World of Warcraft characters. They're trying to steal all of these secrets. But in order to do that, again, you need to have a back end that's capable of usefully executing on that. So it's a strategic activity. And then the other thing is, which people who talk about cyber espionage forget, is for it to be a worthwhile strategic activity, it has to fit into some kind of a valid geopolitical context. It's completely stupid for me to steal, your plans for your next battleship if I'm not planning on eventually trying to sink your battleship or build my own battleship, which means I'm thinking of having a navy, or I'm thinking of destroying a navy. Unless I'm willing to play at the level where I'm thinking of having a navy or destroying a navy, it's completely pointless for me to have any information about your navy unless I can, somehow sell it, right? In which case I'm just a criminal. Right? So this is one of the places where people who talk about cyber war, and we're getting a great deal of this from people in the U.S. government right now, they're not exactly lying to you. And to tell you the truth, I don't know whether they're just stupid or whether they're lying. I haven't been able to figure it out. We have a great deal of this in the U.S. Do any of you watch Fox News? Okay? My experience, I don't watch television, but every so often I get stuck in an airport where somebody's got Fox News on or something like that. And I just sit there and I go, are these people serious? Or have they just been propagandized into complete, utter insensibility? And I think the answer is yes, right? They're nuts. But the issue with cyber espionage is that it really only appeals to those people who have no sense of the geopolitics surrounding a particular problem domain that they're talking about, right? Let me just talk a little bit more about China in the context of cyber espionage. Why would the Chinese want to launch a cyber attack or cyber steal from our economy when they already own it? Right? You probably know maybe that in 1994, the Chinese government got all the source code for Microsoft Windows. A few of you I see nodding, right? A few of you remember that, right? How did they get it? They asked for it. They said, we won't let you sell Windows in China if you don't give us the source code. Microsoft said, you want that on a DVD or on a hard drive? Right? How do you steal from a capitalist? In the boardroom. That's how you steal from a capitalist. You ask nicely. You say, look, here's $10 billion, right? Access to our gigantic pool of slave labor, access to our gigantic growing market, and the capitalist immediately says, what do I have to do to get your money? Right? Another one that's fascinating on the cyber espionage front was, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a big hoopla about a Chinese company called Huawei. Huawei is competing with Cisco using routers that look a lot like Cisco's routers. Never mind the fact that routers all kind of look like routers, which means that they probably all kind of look like Cisco routers in that they route traffic, right? But so this company, Huawei, starts producing routers. Well, where did Huawei come from? Well, it's backed by the Chinese government. That's because you can't start a significant business in China without the government being involved. That's one reason it's backed by the Chinese government. Huawei is actually a joint effort between the Chinese government and an American company called 3Com. 3Com agreed that if the Chinese government let them have access to their slave labor, to their low-cost labor in China, that they could build a manufacturing plant, that they would be able to build devices and then sell them back to the United States at a lower price because it was too expensive to build them in the U.S. 3Com thought this was a great idea, exported all sorts of intellectual property, essentially trained the Chinese government how to build routers, and now they're competing with Cisco. What did you expect? Right? So the one question you should be asking yourself when people talk about cyber espionage is, yes, so what? Right? It's just how things are done. Now, the cyber era does simplify a few things. Unless you've got really terrible broadband like I do at home, it's transporting 14 terabytes has become easier. Right? And you can use Dropbox, or you can use some sort of file sharing in order to transport large amounts of information. There are some things that can be done more easily anonymously. I'm sure that there's generations of Cold War spies that used to have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and take their dog for a walk in the park and to pick the microdots off the bottom of the park bench. I'm sure those guys are grateful that they can now just do it via an FTP site or pull it down from Twitter. But by and large, that's really the main changes that have happened to cyber espionage since the Cold War. Now let's talk about terrorism. Terrorism is an interesting problem. The agenda of a terrorist is completely different from these other claims that I've been talking about. Right? They're interested in doing maximum profile, maximum damage stuff. The definition of terror is to try to change the political process from outside the political process. So you're trying to influence someone's political process from outside. How do you do this? You scare the crap out of it. That's one way you threaten. Right? So terrorism is ultimately about being threatened. This is one of the reasons why, for all the proponents of cyber war talk about cyber terror as being a big problem, there really hasn't been very much. Because barring techniques to cause massive flaming disasters, cyber terror is just not that big of a deal. Right? Ooh, you take away my access to World of Warcraft for a couple of days. I'm going to commit suicide and eat my dog. No, it's not going to happen. Right? If you knock my ATM network off the air for a week, I'm going to use cash. It's not going to slow me down. If you're able to bring down an airplane using some kind of cyber terror technique, then I'm going to notice, right? And I'm going to get upset. But I'm going to get exactly as upset about that as I would over any other airplane crash, especially if it's one that I was on at the time. But if a plane crashes, it's a plane crash. That's what's scary, right? And so the cyber terrorist proponents, the people who are saying we need to be very worried about this, again, they're playing this kind of intellectually dishonest game. There's lots of ways to bring down an airplane. I don't want to talk about that because it's kind of disgusting. But I mean, it's as simple as apparently throwing a goose into the engine while it's taking off. Like, you can't bring down an airplane. We should be very concerned about cyber terrorists trying to throw frozen geese into airplane engines because it's just as likely to be a credible threat as any other way of bringing down an airplane with something to do with cyber something or other. So, but there is threat. That's one of the reasons why the cyber war, cyber terror, cyber crime, whatever meme, has carried some weight, is because a person who's rational and intelligent, who knows anything about information security, can sit there. I mean, how many of you guys work with medical informatics? Okay. How many of you work with SCADA systems? Okay, a few of you, okay. Right, so I can see, I mean, you've all seen stuff with the SCADA systems that make you clutch your temples with terror and go, oh my God, I can't believe they really did that, right? So you see these things, and it's completely plausible. Because you assume that if an attacker knew what you knew and wanted, the sewage in some town to go backwards or whatever it was to happen, they could do that. The problem is that they actually really don't care because they're busy doing other stuff, like fighting the Israeli army or something like that, which keeps you pretty busy. And they don't really have the ability to come over here and try to do that kind of thing. If you want something scary to think about, in terms of a cyber terror threat, a better model, which fits exactly with the model of cyber terror, is to ask yourself, well, what would just happen? Let's imagine that we were all, terrorists. If we all just started applying for jobs in places where we could just really screw things up, right? So we're just going to all go work for power plants, and we'll just twist the wrong buttons at the wrong times, and we're just going to mess things up. We're going to become U.S. congressmen. We're going to screw up the U.S. economy. How about that? Now that is a terrorist threat that's actually fairly plausible, and rumors is that it's actually already happened. If you want to think that someone is going to engage in strategic terror activity, you need to raise the game far beyond the kind of trivial attacks that people are worrying about when they talk about cyber terror. And I don't want to seem dismissive, when people talk about, oh, somebody could take off a piece of the power grid using a cyber terror attack. But you have to ask yourself, what is the value of taking off a piece of the power grid? Why would you do this? When you hear pundits talking about a cyber terror attack that would take off pieces of the power grid, and you ask them, well, what is exactly that you're worried about? Well, if the U.S. power grid was down for a week, people would start eating their dogs and kids. They would start killing and eating each other. And everybody would lose their mind. And they go, but that happens all the time. I live up in north central Pennsylvania. In the winter, we go weeks without power when the power lines come down because of trees. This doesn't bother me. I just, I have 3 generators. And if I run low, I'll borrow one from my neighbor. This isn't a problem. I haven't eaten anybody. It's not a big deal. And they go, well, people in New York would lose their minds. Well, actually, people in New York are pretty rational too. And they can survive. Humans do that. I remember I was on a panel once talking about cyber terror, and the guy said, so usually when I'm on a panel with other security experts, they all move to the other end of the table, and it's basically me versus them, because I feel like I'm sometimes the only person who's trying to be the voice of reason. And these guys are all saying, oh, this is really bad. Somebody, was able to break down the aircraft reservation systems that would cause chaos, and there'd be dying in the streets and everything. And I said, well, a volcano in Iceland did that, 2 years ago? All the planes weren't flying to and from Europe. I have a friend who spent 3 whole extra days in Paris. He must have put on 5 pounds. This isn't too bad. I mean, he did have to pay egregious Paris hotel rates for egregious Paris hotel. But all things considered, it wasn't so awful, right? Humans work around these kinds of problems. So the point about cyber terror, and then I'll move on, is we really need to ask ourselves how serious this is. Yes, there are plausible scenarios that you can come up with. But if you want to think like a terrorist, there are actual plausible, damaging, horrible scenarios that you can come up with that are much easier and much safer to execute. Now, people will frequently talk about the ability to launch cyber attacks anonymously from a distance. I have a technology that allows me to launch lethal attacks anonymously from a distance. It's called a rifle. It's actually much easier to use than a cyber weapon, and it's actually much harder to detect and backtrack than a cyber weapon. Now, obviously, in some places it's a little hard to get that, but there's a good reason why. Right? Now, let's talk about cyber war. This is where it gets a little weird to me. So the agenda of a cyber warrior is to be prepared to attack, degrade, penetrate, whatever, take over an enemy command and control system as some sort of an adjunct to some kind of physical military operations. Now, I've had people accuse me of manipulating that first definition in order to make my argument stronger. I've got to leave that to you to decide. So what I'll ask you to do is to reread that first definition and think about whether it's fair or not. We don't need to argue about it here, but just think about whether or not I'm trying to manipulate your perception of how I made that definition. But in Marcus land, I would say it's really quite pointless. Let's pick a scenario, okay? Quebec decides that it's going to bring down the US electronic infrastructure prior to, well, what? Well, why would you want to bring down the US electronic infrastructure? If all of you guys, grabbed your rifles and invaded, you'd fill one of the boroughs of New York City, right? Our population is humongous. The only country in the world that's got a population that could remotely do anything useful against the United States would be China. And in case anyone hasn't looked lately, they're on the other side of the planet. How are they going to get to the US? They don't actually have a massive infrastructure that would allow them to invade the United States, invade North America. By the way, we would expect you Canadians to help if they tried that. But there's no strategic threat of war with China until we see them building a hell of a lot of boats, which they're not doing, by the way. They just built they built a ridiculously expensive aircraft carrier like one of ours, so their navy's, it's a joke kind of like ours. But you need to look at where is the strategic viability of this going, and does it make any sense in any kind of geopolitical context? Otherwise, it makes no sense whatsoever, right? Imagine, if you will, that the government of Liechtenstein had in place, cyber attack capability against the U.S. So what? They get angry at us and they bring down our network, and then we bring it back up and then we cream them. That's pretty much what happens, right? So there has to be some kind of it's just like the problem with stealing Joint Strike Fighter plans. You have to have the capability of building a Joint Strike Fighter in order to make it worth having those plans. You have to have the capability of winning a war in order to make it worth fighting a cyber war. Which brings me to another point about the Chinese cyber war threat, which is, remember, if the Chinese crashed the US economy by bringing down our power grid and all this kind of stuff, they would be writing down their own investment. They own 1/3 of the US economy right now. And you can see what happened when we basically brought down our own economy in 2009. It hurt the Chinese very badly, right? Because we stopped buying Chinese-made stuff. We stopped buying new tennis shoes every month. It dramatically impacted the Chinese economy. So they have absolutely no interest in doing this. So who has the interest? Who has the political interest? And who has the military interest in preparing a cyber war against the United States? Actually, nobody. So who has the interest in us being prepared for a cyber war against the United States? Well, we have this political military industrial complex that's always looking for new weapons to sell, to new places to sell them to. And they've got cyber war in their sights. They want to sell everybody lots and lots of fear, right? And they want, as a consequence of that fear, they want to sell lots and lots of defenses. Now, ironically, I made some of those defenses back in the day, and I still do. So I stand to make some money from that. That's pretty good. I get my turn at the trough. But what's basically going on is that, the same contractors, the same beltway bandits that convinced the US government that they should outsource all of their networks to those self-same contractors are now coming back and saying our networks are insecure, those being the networks we just built for you. Our networks are insecure. We need billions more dollars in order to secure them against, the Chinese, right? And so essentially these guys are saying we screwed up and we want $1 billion or $10 billion to screw up even harder. Because that's what you're going to get. If you give a lot of money to people who screw up, you don't get good stuff, you get bigger, better screw-ups, right? So that's a problem. Anyway, the strategic issue around cyber war is the one that I think people ignore a great deal. There's also the problem that strategic attacks take time to put in place. Any of you who've got experience working with network management should get a chuckle out of this. Think about a cyber weapon as essentially being able to remote manage your target's network. Because really that's what you have to do. You have to have administrators. In order to successfully attack my network, you have to achieve a level of administrative control over my network that allows you to do stuff that I don't want done with it. So essentially you need, I don't know, like a weaponized version of Unicenter, right? That can be deployed instantly. Now, how many of you have ever seen an instant, saying the words instantaneous Unicenter deployment together should just trigger a child? It just doesn't happen. And in fact, if you imagine, you know, it has to be the case that the government of Liechtenstein probably has very different systems, very different network layouts, different core devices, different software mixes, different user bases. Everything in Liechtenstein is completely different from in the US, which is completely different from in Canada, which probably, you know, probably the Quebecois do it differently from everyone else, from what I understand in kind of Canadian politics, right? And in fact, if you look at in the US, we have some government agencies that if those guys buy Cisco routers, they'll buy Wellfleet routers just because they can't work together because they're part of the same government, yada, yada, yada. So in order to build a cyber weapon that would allow somebody to launch a successful attack against a target, we're not talking the situation where someone comes along and says, okay, we're attacking France next week. Be ready. And they go, no problem, right? It'll be more like, well, we're attacking France, and they would go, great, well, we might be ready to do something to France in 5 to 6 years. And, right, that doesn't work so well. And this is one of the reasons why I personally have been very dismissive of cyber weapons. Because if you call up the commander of the 101st Airborne and say, we'd like you to see what you can do to France, they'll go, well, we can be there in a week, right? They're not going to be really happy with somebody saying, you know, we need 4 to 5 years to be prepared to do something about this. Just to give you a case in point on that, and then I'll move on. Remember Stuxnet, right? Everybody talks about Stuxnet. The actual attack that was used in Stuxnet was invented at Idaho National Labs in 2007. It took 2 years for that technique to be weaponized to be used against Iran. And I think that's actually probably a pretty realistic time frame for what we would call strategic cyber war type activities, right? Now, in the case of Stuxnet, Stuxnet is a perfect example because in order for Stuxnet to do the things that it did against the Bushehr nuclear reactor and against Natanz, a tremendous amount of intelligence information had to be welded into Stuxnet. This is one of the things a lot of people don't realize about Stuxnet. It doesn't get a great deal of attention in the press. The Stuxnet engine understands the layout of the PLCs for a gas centrifuge cascade that is exactly, by some coincidence, exactly configured the way the one at Natanz is. No two gas centrifuges are configured the same. Whoever it was who wrote Stuxnet was privy to the exact layout of the network at Natanz before they wrote it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. More to the point, they knew how an RP1 gas centrifuge worked, which means they must have had their hands on one. Because last time, I mean, I actually have a stored search on eBay looking for RP1 gas centrifuges, and they haven't come up, I'll tell you that. Right? There are not a lot of RP1 centrifuges available. Somebody must have had RP1s in order to test Stuxnet to make sure that it worked correctly. Because what you're doing is you're varying the positioning of the rotors in a 3-phase motor, and you're varying that position by changing the frequency of the current. And what you're basically doing is you're making it so that as the rotor is spinning, the current is acting against it once it's spun up, and it just wears the bearings out. And that's what happened. That's what happened with Natanz. So somebody had RP1s to just throw away. Who has RP1s to throw away? Well, Muammar Gaddafi used to have RP1s to throw away. And in a fit of irony, considering that he was recently deposed by allied American, British, and whatnot forces, we talked him into giving up his nuclear ambitions. And one of the things that he did as part of that deal was he gave us all of his enrichment line. And so there's actually a pretty good supply of RP1 gas centrifuges in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in the United States. I'm not trying to get you to draw any inferences, but that's just something to think about. Okay, so now the agendas of these characters. The cyber criminals are tactical and they're profit-driven. The cyber spies are strategic and they're surreptitious. The cyber terrorists are tactical and they're maximum profile, right? And the cyber warriors are strategic and they're destructive. If this was an online dating site, There is no compatibility between any of these parties. The cyber spies want to go in there and be secret, whereas the cyber criminals are in there and they're installing new pieces of malware that are making you read your system logs and look at your upgrade to read your system logs, and looking at your outbound firewall logs, right? You look at those too, because you're trying to find the cyber criminals malware, and you find the cyber spy stuff, right? So the cyber spy, if there were such a thing, would be, crazy to use anything that looked remotely like off-the-shelf malware, because they'd be much more likely to get caught, especially if the comments are all made in China or whatever, right? So these guys are completely disaligned. The cyber terrorist, again, is completely disaligned from both the criminal and the spy, right? So while you're hardening your networks to protect yourself against the Russian business network guys, you're also, coincidentally, hardening your network to protect yourself against the cyber terrorists. And you're increasing your chances of detecting the cyber spies. Now, this is a really important point, because as you're putting in place all of your system log analysis, and you're looking at your outbound firewall rules, and you're doing all this sort of stuff, if you actually had cyber spies operating on your network, you might have found them. And the fact that there's a fairly small amount of plausible information coming out about cyber espionage, I find extremely provocative. Now, there's a great deal of talk about it, right? You'll see spokesmen for the US government saying, American corporations are finding this stuff all the time. But what happens is when I go to security conferences, and I'm pretty well plugged into the industry, right? People don't come up to me and go, hey Marcus, we were looking at this thing the other day, and it's got China written all over it, That doesn't happen. I get people who say, well, we got owned by the Russian business network again. That happens all the time. But occasionally, and in the last 2 years, I have heard of 3 cases that I would say probably really do sound like industrial espionage, that probably had some kind of backing from somebody who knew what they were doing. But it's not the level that we're being sold. That's really what concerns me. And remember, just looking for cybercrime and hardening your network against cybercrime works against all these other guys. And of course, same thing for the cyber warriors. Let's talk a little bit about agenda misalignment. This chart is kind of an eye test, I'm sorry about that. But if you actually look at the relationships between these different characters, if they're operating inside your network, for example, you see that the cyber spies, your search for the cyber spy may increase your likelihood of detecting a cyber terrorist. Or conversely, your search for the cyber terrorist might increase your likelihood of detecting a cyber spy, right? These guys aren't friends. And then, of course, the other one would be the cyber warrior and the cyber spy are definitely opposed. Let's talk about some misalignments in a minute. So the operational needs of some of these organizations are very, very isolated. The cyber criminals, the terrorists, are going to operate on a completely independent schedule. They need no logistical training. They really don't need any government support. I mean, if I wanted to be a cyber terrorist tomorrow, I would be one by Friday, right? But if I wanted to be a cyber spy, I would have to start trying to figure out how to set up an entire network for laundering my information. I'd have to figure out who was going to pay me and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? So it's a much longer logistical trail on those. And the cyber spies and the cyber warriors have these overlapping operational needs, which actually are in conflict. What do I mean by that? So our cyber warrior over here is putting in place his weaponized version of Unicenter to remote control my network. And the cyber spy is just getting into my NOC so he can sneak data out. Well, the fact that people are looking for the weaponized Unicenter might mean that they're going to catch the spy, which really annoys him. But what happens when things come to a head and it's time for the war to start? Well, the warrior crashes all the network and the spy says, thanks, you just blinded me. Because all the networks are down, the spy can't do anything. You blow up my NOC, you've just taken my best source of information away. So here's a misalignment scenario I just talked about, right? Imagine we're in the war room, all the generals are there and everything like that, and the cyber spies are there, the cyber warriors are there, the cyber warriors hit the destroy button, and boom, the US networks go black, and the spy says, great, now I got no idea what's going on. I could have given you their satellite imagery yesterday, but you just hit that button and now I can't tell you anything. You you've just sent me back 20 years, thanks, right? Doesn't work so well. And in Soviet Russia, you just get shot for doing that. Another misalignment scenario, and this is the one that really bothers me about the whole picture, is that something that's completely out of your cycle of control can disarm you, right? So imagine we're in the cyber war room, we've got all the generals, not the cyber war room, it's the main war room. The generals are the guys with guns, the real soldiers. The generals are there, the admirals are there, and yeah, the guy from Cyber Command is there. And the president says, go, launch the attack. And the guy from Cyber Command goes, excuse me, do you have something you wanted to say? Yes, sir. Today's Wednesday. Well, what's the significance of today being Wednesday? Private. Yesterday was Patch Tuesday. And Microsoft pushed out a patch, and we no longer control their network server, right? At which point the generals drag you out. Blam! That's the end of you, right? Well, at least that's how it's done in most of the rest of the world. This is a big problem. There is not really any way that you can rely on a cyber weapon. Now, any of you who've ever served in the military or who've actually been at the sharp end of the spear, imagine how well you would react if someone said, I'm going to give you a rifle that at any moment the enemy could just take away from you with a mouse click. I quit. Okay, that comes to mind, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about defense strategies and what to do about this. I think I'm probably out of time. Here's the other part about this that's very frustrating. If you think about the ways that we can defend against these different threats, there really aren't any. The way we defend against this stuff is using what I call typical internet security. You use firewalls, you use endpoint protection, you run intrusion detection systems, you do log analysis, you do typical internet security. There is, in the realm of typical internet security, there is no super secret level above and beyond what we have in the commercial sector. I can tell you that categorically. If I had some super cool internet security technology that only the Department of Defense could have, believe me, I would civilianize and I would sell it to you guys and I'd be driving a Ferrari. It doesn't exist, right? The Department of Defense, the military-industrial complex, the intelligence community, all that they have is firewalls, SSL, intrusion detection, antivirus, log analysis, all of the exact same tools that we have. The only additional thing that a government can bring to the table in militarizing cyberspace is counterintelligence. Yes, the government can afford spies to go out and figure out what the other guy's spies are doing. That's what we pay them for. And that's actually the problem with this slide, which jumps out at me immediately. Frequently in Washington, what we hear is we need more cooperation from the private sector in order to handle these problems. I love it when I hear someone from the government say that when I'm in the room, because I usually raise my hand and say, I thought that's what I was paying you to do. You're the National Security Agency. Why don't you, secure the nation or something? That's what we pay your $30 billion a year budget to do. Because as a member of a civilian organization, I'm not really qualified or interested in carrying out espionage operations against the Chinese. That's what you do. And they don't like that. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just because I'm a real jerk the way that I phrase it. But the problem is, really, what can you legitimately expect civilian organizations to do other than be the best possible custodians that they can of their existing data? Right? You secure your networks. Everybody do the best job that you can to secure your networks and leave the spying to the government. That's what you pay the taxes for them to do. They have no business asking you to carry out espionage. Now you can cooperate. If you find something that looks like cyber spies, do something about it. But the best thing you can do is read your system logs, look at your outgoing firewall logs, have firewalls, install intrusion detection, do log analysis, make sure you've got anti-malware up to date, and just secure your stuff. The great thing about this is it will improve your posture against cyber criminals, which are your real problem, as well as against cyber terrorists and cyber spies and cyber warriors. Right? So the private sector can and should continue doing exactly what it's doing. And don't accept any additional pressure from governments that are asking you essentially to compromise your existing business practices in order to solve a problem that they're supposed to be solving on your behalf. And don't make them make you spend more money to solve a problem that you're already paying them to solve on your behalf. Right? Which, of course, you wouldn't be surprised to know that they don't really like that message a whole lot. So I've already talked about that. Let me just sort of bounce forward a little bit. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about Stuxnet, and then I'm just going to jump past that. Terminology is critical in these things. If you define terrorism the way that the FBI defines terrorism, which is an attempt to change the political process from outside by using non-political means, Stuxnet is terrorism. It was probably state-sponsored terrorism. I have a good idea, I know which state sponsored it, in fact, right? The other question is, was it a violation of international humanitarian law? Or was it both? My answer, of course, is both. If you actually, I appear to be the only American that I know who has actually read the Geneva Conventions, all the conventions and all the protocols. And if you read the second protocol from 1970, it specifically says that nuclear reactors are 100% off limits for anything in any kind of conflict, be it armed or unarmed. Another thing that the Geneva Conventions say, that they're very, very clear about, is that civilian targets are off limits in conflict, whether it's armed, unarmed, insurgency, counterinsurgency, whatever. They simply say civilian targets are off limits during conflict. Now, this has been reinterpreted to mean that you can blow civilians up anytime it's convenient for you to do so. But as a civilian, I really am not particularly thrilled with that interpretation. But when people talk about cyber war and the prospect that cyber attacks could be cleaner than a military intervention, I don't know if any of you heard this absolutely horrifying thing said shortly after Stuxnet, but there were people in the intelligence community going around with a straight face and saying, well, Stuxnet saved the Iranians a good old-fashioned bombing. Holy crap. You know, my reaction when people would say stuff like that is, I can't believe what a monster you are, right? I mean, you're talking about, right, the Bashir nuclear reactor, this is a relevant piece from the Geneva Protocols, but at Bashir reactor, the components that were interfered with by Stuxnet were the coolant pumps. Having just come back from Chernobyl, this is extremely relevant to me. One of the problems Chernobyl had was a sudden failure of cooling, which caused it to cool up. Let's not talk more about that. That's rather depressing. Although, there's two different ways that you can think about international politics. You can either say, we're an imperial power, and frankly, because we've got this big stick, what we say goes. And everybody else, you just have to lump it if you don't like it. That's one way of approaching world politics. It's a way of doing it. It worked for Rome, it worked for England, it worked for the US. It's one way of doing things. The problem is when you're on the receiving end, when you're no longer the big dog, you have no moral backbone to complain when other people just chew you up and spit you out in revenge, right? So there's two approaches to dealing with the international community. One is you basically say it's my way or the highway. The other is you cooperate. And the only way you can cooperate is to say, I'm not going to do anything to you that I wouldn't be reasonably comfortable if you did back to me, which is a huge problem for me as a U.S. citizen, because I'm very concerned about things like Stuxnet. I'm very concerned about these unmanned drone attacks that we're launching all over the world, because as far as I can tell, if it's okay for us to blow up any old Pakistani that we don't like with a drone, well, actually, I'm kind of hoping the Pakistanis would send a drone over and blow up former President Bush, but it's probably not going to happen. We wouldn't appreciate that. And so I often think about, how would the American military establishment, take it if, the Quebecois started trying to liberate Buffalo, New York, because they feel like it, right? Sending drones down to kill people. This is a problem. But it is a serious question. Right? Would Iran be justified in launching a counterattack against the United States or Israel? Not an attack, a counterattack, right? They could say, you did this to us with Stuxnet. You took one of our reactors and you took an uranium enrichment plant offline. So we're going to take Oak Ridge, Tennessee offline. Right? What would happen if they did that? You know what would happen, right? the First Air War retrooping on airplanes and they'd fly off and kill somebody. So I think it was a war crime. We need to think about this. We need to talk about this. The computer security community really needs to talk about this. We need to take this seriously. I know people who are in the intelligence community whose moral sense of well-being has been utterly destroyed by what happened after September 11th when the U.S. went into Iraq under false pretenses. And I don't want to see my cybersecurity friends have to deal with that same problem. I don't want us to wake up someday and discover that cybersecurity was used as the root cause for a war that got hundreds of thousands of people uselessly killed. I like people. I love all people. I love all the people in the world. They're pretty much cool. It's the governments that I can't stand, and it's those guys that cause the problems, and we need to figure out how to keep those guys in control. And the only way we can do that is by talking to them and not letting them stampede us into getting scared whenever they ring a little bell, right? We're salivate like Pavlov's dogs. So let me wrap this up. There's not enough of a gap between the problems of cyber warfare and cyber espionage that we can really treat them as different things. They tend to be so close that if they really even existed, they would be using the same tools, they'd be using the same methods. So we may as well treat them as the same thing. And from our standpoint, on the defensive side, the defenses against them are exactly the same, right? They're both strategic long-term covert penetrations. And if you're concerned about strategic long-term covert penetrations, you're either a government, in which case it's part of your job, or if you're a civilian organization, what are you going to do? Are you going to start doing background checks to make sure that the guy who's running your NOC is not a KGB agent or an agent of the government of Liechtenstein or an agent of any of the other governments that might want to achieve that kind of capability? Of course you're not. Your job is to go with operating your NOC. And frankly, you'll hire anyone who's a good network manager, regardless of what his allegiance is, as long as he works weekends, right? There's not enough of a gap between cyber crime and cyber warfare on the flip side, right? So they're the same thing. The premises of cyber war, one of the reasons why I try to refute the entire idea of cyber war, is that it really is not a battlefield that has the properties of a battlefield. One of the great things you can do in the cyber battlefield is you can actually just vanish from the battlefield by hitting a button. You can't do that in a real battlefield, but you can do that in cyberspace. The other thing is you can control time and space in cyberspace. You can have all the space you want. You can use someone else's space. You can create new space. There is no logistical problem per se in cyberspace because you get to rewrite all of that on demand. And so when people talk about the rules of warfare, they talk about treating cyberspace like a new war domain, it tells me two things. It tells me, first off, they don't understand anything about cyberspace. And secondly, it tells me they probably don't understand much about warfare either, which is very concerning to me because a lot of people who are talking about this, work for the Pentagon. The best defense in cyberspace is not a strong offense because you don't know who your enemy is. You can't simply walk around and go, I think you're about to attack me, and punch him out. You have to take the first punch, which means that the only thing that works is the best defense is a really good defense, and that's what those of us who work in civilian computer security are chartered with doing anyway, and that's what we should be about doing. And then lastly, the logistical problems of fielding cyber weapons are just absurd, right? Imagine a weaponized unicenter that's going to work against all different flavors of operating systems and all the different security systems that your target might deploy without you knowing it, that's going to allow you to completely take over their network on demand. Imagine what it would take just to keep that up to date when you're not inside their change control loop. Most organizations can't even do that with their own networks, let alone somebody else's. Right? Most people that I know who are building large enterprise class networks have no idea what their own computers are doing, let alone knowing what my computers are doing. Right? So this is a big problem. There is a tremendous utility to strategic intelligence. Now, I certainly hope that countries all around the world are spying on each other so that there can't be sneak attacks and stuff like that. I really like the idea of that. Because one of the best ways to reduce the chance of successful wars happening is for everybody to know everything about what everybody else is doing. So I'd like to see things go in that direction. So just to wrap up, spies are going to win the next war. It's not going to be soldiers that are going to win the next war. When it gets down to the point where it's bayonet versus bayonet, you've already lost. Right? The people who are going to win the next war are the guys who manipulated the other guy into a corner. And then they woke up one day and somebody said, you know, by the way, we own 2/3 of your economy, so we're foreclosing on you, get out. Right? And that's how that's going to happen. From your standpoint, from those of us in the civilian world who are on the receiving end of this threat, the thing we have to do is maintain vigilance. And all we have is typical internet security. And typical internet security is not bad. It's actually pretty good stuff, right? So what we need to do is read our system logs, keep our firewalls up to date, look at your exit logs on your firewall, all the basic stuff, because that's really all you've got. And then think about counter-espionage. If you're doing any counterintelligence, if you work for a government. Do we have any spies here? Just kidding. For all I know, you're all spies. Anyway, so that's what I had to say. I hope it might have been interesting or useful or not. Should I try to field questions, or should I just slink off?
We'll take questions up where I might walk over. Anybody have any questions? I'll throw one out there to get it going if you want. How does the current current Chinese thing compare to the 1980s Cold War era?
Okay, very interesting. Well, so we're not exactly in a new Cold War with China. And that's a very important point, because a lot of the people who are talking about the cyber war problems are kind of painting a Cold War picture, because they grew up during the Cold War and they only see international relationships through the eyes of the Cold War. In fact, we didn't really engage in a great deal of trade with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. China is our biggest partner, and vice versa. If you wanted to think about it, in terms of analogy, if it was a new Cold War, China is our Germany. And there is nobody who's playing the role of the USSR. So the situation as it's being portrayed is extremely lopsided. I really think, I wish that we could all just collectively tell the U.S. government to just shut the hell up about this whole cyber war thing, but that's not going to happen. We have to argue with them rationally. But again, one of the threat scenarios that comes up a lot, which is straight out of the Cold War, is what if the Chinese invade Taiwan? As this one comes up a great deal. Taiwan is in the process of trying to reintegrate with China to a certain degree. They're engaging in ever-increasing economic ties. China doesn't want to invade Taiwan. China wants to absorb Taiwan just like they absorb Hong Kong. There's not going to be any fighting done other than maybe on the Taiwan Stock Exchange. But actually, the provocation towards war is the nuclear-armed American carrier task force group that sits right off of Taiwan to make sure that doesn't happen. So Cold War analogies are really, really fascinating. I don't think any of this applies. This is more, it's not even a commercial war. They're not even our competitors. They're our best friends. And I'm constantly amazed. I wrote a blog entry about this last year. I'm constantly amazed why a junior branch of the U.S. Department of Justice is accusing the United States' largest trading partner of acts of war. If anyone should be accusing our largest trading partner of acts of war, it should be the State Department. And that should only be being done when Hillary Clinton is on a very short leash, with Obama's hand around the back of her collar, and she can go rah, 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 all that kind of stuff. That's what the State Department is for. So why the FBI and the intelligence community are doing this really shocks me. Other questions? I answered that one too long. I probably just scared everybody off. I can go on and on about this stuff as you see. Yes? He's bringing the mic.
Thank you very much for the refreshing presentation you did about this, government versus private. But my question is about what exactly do you feel about the government power that it has actually in the United States, spying on the people versus spying on the foreign threats?
Okay, as far as, if I got your question correct, what is the government's ability to identify which people are doing what as opposed to what was being published in the press? Is that correct?
Taking the most text to protect people, and at the same time being involved in a huge scale spying, leading to private lives.
Yes. Okay, so I would say it seems to me reasonable beyond a doubt that there's a huge amount of spying going on against the United States. It seems to me reasonable beyond a doubt that some of that is being done at least with the awareness or with the tacit approval of the Chinese government. I'm okay with all of that. What I'm not okay with is when people start throwing accusations that could be a cause of war and not backing that up with evidence, right? I mean, that'd be like saying the Iraqis have weapons of mass destruction, let's go invade them. Well, that'd be stupid. Nobody would do that. But let me give you a slightly different perspective on some of this. First off, when you hear in the U.S. press that the Chinese government has been training all of these cyber warriors, flip that around and ask yourself, if you were a Chinese citizen and you saw tens of thousands of U.S. government employees attending SANS and learning how to be certified penetration testers, would you call that the U.S. having a massive program of training cyber warriors or not? Or when you saw that the U.S. has companies that make things like Nessus that could be used to audit somebody without their permission. Am I a cyber arms dealer, I guess is what I'm saying, right? So the problem with all of these things is that these accusations have to be tied to some kind of a meaningful agenda. Now, here's the place where I think things get confusing about China. In China, if you're caught hacking Chinese government systems, you get executed. In the US, if you get caught hacking US government systems, you get a book deal. You get to be like Kevin Mitnick and go to conferences and tell everybody how bad, I abused you and now pay me. So there certainly is an incentive in China, if you're curious about networks and you're at the university and you want to hack someplace, well, where else are you going to hack? A lot of Chinese people speak English, so American networks are transparent intellectually to them, and they know that they're not going to have the government trying to exert force to catch them. So I think that what's really going on is that China, with 50% of the world's internet population right now, is an environment in which the U.S. is open season. You can do anything you like to the U.S. without any fear, without any repercussion. And that's what's really going on. Conversely, by the way, in the U.S., you can pretty much do anything you like to Chinese systems as well, and they're not going to do anything to you. If I was a hacker, I wouldn't be going after American systems. I'd be going after Chinese systems. And meanwhile, the Russians and the Romanians are fat, dumb, and happy because they go after everybody. And if somebody complains, they go, yeah, so what? Like, tell it to Vladimir, he doesn't care. So I think it's just a people problem. And it's a perception problem, yes, but it's more an issue that the regulatory environments don't create a healthy balance for cyberspace. I think I sort of answered around your question.
Any more questions?
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time. It's been wonderful.